Hi, everyone. I know you're coming in, so I'm letting you all in as I'm speaking, and we will start right at the top of the hour. Loving that it's already coming to the end of the day. I'm sure some of you are tired, but still willing to learn a lot, which is great. And our team here is willing to and wanting to educate you and get you even more knowledgeable. So I'm just letting everyone in, and then we'll get started right at the top of the hour. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I hope that your day is going really well. I hope that you feel really smart and empowered. And actually, while I'm just letting everyone in, I just want to remind everybody that even in today, we want you to ask questions. We want this to be interactive. We're going to have a little bit of a presentation and some questions and answers and things like that. But because we have such a little bit of time, I want to remind everybody that there is the exhibit hall. And so our experts are going to be there. So even if after this meeting and you walk away and you go, oh, I wanted to ask that question, please feel free to visit them in the exhibit hall. There's people there that can answer your questions, and you definitely want to virtually walk around all of that, because there's a lot of really great stuff going on there as well. And especially, I say, for follow-up, it's a great thing, because I know for me, when I'm learning something, it's not until a little bit later on that I actually think about what kind of a question I could actually ask. Now, so just want to all of now that it is the hour, I start, and I'm just going to say again, welcome everyone. So glad to be starting this. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Angela Tice. I will be just facilitating the call, and I'm going to kind of go through housekeeping a little bit quickly. So a few housekeeping notes. The solution workshops, as you probably experience all throughout the day, will be kept to exactly the 50 minutes. We do have that hard stop. We do that so that you can get ready for your next meeting and be settled and ready for the next conversation. This session, just like probably all the rest that you've been in today, does qualify for one CPE. So if you need the CPE, you do need to answer all of the polling questions, and we will be bringing those to you. Eric will be reminding me that I need to launch those for you. So definitely make sure that you're answering all of the polling questions so that you get your CPE. And really, that's it. I'm just letting people in. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Libros of Oxus, and he's going to kick off this great conversation and get us to learn something new today. So it's all yours, Eric.
Thank you, Angela, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Finance and Accounting Benchmarks, Prophecy or Pretense. My name is Eric Libros, and our firm Oxus provides management consulting and outsourcing services to mid to large enterprise companies across a broad range of industries. I run the company's business transformation practice, which focuses on helping companies improve their business operations, helping them get more higher levels of performance and efficiency in their various functions. And we accomplish this through various service lines, which include shared services, advisory and implementation services, process redesign and automation, organizational restructuring, and business process outsourcing through our center in Costa Rica. I'm going to be moderating a panel discussion today with several people that I'm excited to share the stage with. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you right now. Rachel, let's start with you.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Rachel Collins. I'm with APQC, which stands for American Productivity and Quality Center. And we are a nonprofit benchmarking and best practices research organization. We have a lot of metrics and research for the finance function. And I'm just excited to join the conversation today. So thank you.
Great, Rachel, thanks. And now my associate, Enrique Martinez.
Thanks, Eric. Enrique Martinez. I lead the finance transformation consulting practice at Oxus. In my role, I focus on developing innovative business solutions that help finance executives improve operational efficiency and really transform their entire finance and accounting function. I've got over 15 plus years in global finance operations, shared services, and outsourcing industries. Not a career consultant. I consider myself an accountant by trade. Prior to my consulting experience, I spent 10 years at a global investment bank and various controllership and finance executive roles. Excited to be here. I thank you all for being here virtually with us, and look forward to this discussion.
Great, thanks, Enrique. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a panel discussion, but first we're going to start with a brief presentation on the topic of benchmarking, focusing on the types of benchmarking data that will help provide good insights into your operations. And we're going to give you some real life examples of how benchmarking can help you create a roadmap to performance improvement and some of the key strategies that you can use to help get you there. So with that, I'll have Enrique take it away.
Thank you, Eric. So, look, there's no doubt of the impact that the pandemic has had on companies, right? This year we've been operating in an area of unprecedented business disruption that has really been led by continued uncertainty. In our roles, finance executives are feeling the pressure, being questioned about staffing levels, and really being asked to do more with less. So leveraging industry benchmarks to rate the services provided by your function can be an important component in assessing the existing health and quality of your business operations. We've got several studies here that we're quoting, but as evident by industry leaders like APQC and PwC, operating costs can vary significantly within an industry. And really, a top performer typically operates about half the cost of their industry peers, right? One very interesting observation by APQC in a recent study found that companies that benchmark their processes were 14% more effective in managing their business processes, right? So what does that really tell us, right? I think it does, if you incorporate benchmarking in managing your function, the data points to significant benefit realization, right? So anyway, so this is why we're excited to talk about this topic today. We think that benchmarks can help you identify areas of opportunities to restructure your finance and accounting organization, reduce staff, automate, revise focus to really more value-added activities, all part of post-pandemic's really marching orders for finance executives. Excuse me. So let's just start with some of the basics, right? So when we talk about standard benchmark terminology that we're going to be discussing throughout the session, when we talk about top performer, we really mean the top quartile. That really reflects the performance level that are above 75% of all respondents within a study or within a survey. On the other hand, the bottom performer reflects the bottom 25% of all responses, and median is going to reflect the value, which is really below and essentially your average. Right. So as we look at this particular measure that we're seeing here on this slide, right, the overall cost of the finance function is really one of the most scrutinized KPIs. Right? And as you can see here, there's a significant difference between the top performer and the bottom performer, and really the top performer is almost 2.5 times lower cost than a bottom performer. Okay, so when most people think about KPIs, really think about it as a measure of either cost or quality, right? But really, an optimized finance organization should have a balanced focus on both effectiveness and efficiency of the function. Effectiveness KPIs tend to be more common because they're powerful in measuring cost, and the data tells us that the performance differences between organizations can be really dramatic. For example, according to APQC, there's an 11% difference in invoice processing and payment accuracy between the top performer and the bottom performer. And that really correlates to about a 62% variance in DSO between those two, right? So it can be very impactful. On the other hand, efficiency focuses on productivity, and traditional efficiency KPIs really tend to focus on FTEs or full-time equivalents that may be performing various tasks within your organization. And that really varies by industry and by revenue size. So why is that important, right? Because it's really all about volumes and complexity. Obviously, the higher the revenue, the larger a company is going to be, the more number of transactions you're going to have, and therefore you're going to require more personnel to be able to manage those processes, right? Additionally, within the industries, industries typically tend to have various levels of complexity, right? So for example, if you take a manufacturing and distribution company that's, let's say, is selling to a big box of retailer, the operational complexity for that company is going to be significantly different than let's say, a professional services company that's also selling to the same customer, right? So it is important as we kind of start talking about benchmarks that you're always comparing apples to apples. So on this slide, we just want to give you a little bit of a view of really 5 of the most common benchmarks of finance, and then just kind of explain a little bit for what each one means. So we start from the top. Efficiency KPIs really, again, are going to measure how efficient resources are in performing the work that they do. Right. So again, in just a brief explanation, I want to make a distinction between headcount and FTE. So a headcount, that's going to be the number of employees that you have in your organization, whereas an FTE is really a calculation, a full-time equivalent. And the way you do that is you prorate the number of employees that you have and the hours that are spending in performing each process or activity. And we typically assume a 40-hour per week. Okay, so going down the line, so again, cost KPIs, they're going to measure the fully loaded cost of a process that's going to be really typically normalized by some sort of factor, and that factor usually is revenue. Now, an important KPI for general accounting is to measure the number of days it takes to close the books, right? In other words, cycle time. Cycle time KPIs really measure duration. Usually the lower results, the better. And why is that important? Why do we want to measure cycle time in accounting? Well, that really means that you're able to close your books, produce financial statements, and get critical insights, critical performance insights to your business partners to enable faster decision making. Productivity KPIs measure the output produced per unit, and typically a higher number here is a better KPI, right? So for example, accounts payable, it's important to measure the total number of invoices that are being processed per FTE in your organization, and this really can give you a sense of the efficiency of your department. Additionally, it can guide you for potential areas of opportunity.
So this brings us to our first polling question. Have you used benchmarking to help define process optimization initiatives in your finance organization? Angela, I'll turn that to you.
Great, thank you, Eric. So audience, I just put that up on the screen. So if you can answer those quickly, we can get back to the knowledge that we're gaining through Enrique right now. So again, if you would answer that quickly, I can share that also with everyone so that you can see what everyone has to say. We'll give you just a couple of more seconds. Appreciate that you're answering it quickly, especially that we're getting to the end of the day. That means you're still attentive, and that's a good thing. Okay, I'm going to close that, and I'll just share it with you really quickly, Eric. So it looks like we have 24% say, yes, I've made extensive use of benchmarking. 45% say, yes, I've used it, but it's not been a major factor in my analysis. 31% say no, but I would like to, and no one said, no, I don't see value in benchmarking. That's a good thing.
Well, I don't think they'd be on the webinar if they did. if they did.
Right.
You know, so that the one with the most responses is very interesting. So maybe let's walk through a real world example and really talk about how using benchmarks can really point to areas of opportunity and you know, things that you can do to really achieve those benefits, right? So consider, you know, $600 million multinational CPG company, right? The company has a total of 110 FTEs across the finance organization, right? So when we look at the APC benchmark for this industry, for this size, and for this geography, we can see that according to the benchmark, the FTE count is more than double the bottom performer, right? So now we got to take a couple of things into account, right? And, you know, through conversations with the finance executives, you know, well, they had a little bit of a complex situation, right? So they were operating in 7 different countries in Latin America and North America, and each country had its own finance and accounting function, and each country had its own accounting regulations and compliance requirements. And because they had their own organization, there was a lot of overlap, right? But, you know, it doesn't really take much detailed analysis to be able to see that there's significant opportunity in consolidating operations and be able to increase productivity and really ultimately to decrease costs, right? So even within particular functions, if we look at the R2R function, that's operating at 3 times higher than the bottom performer. So that's a clear area of opportunity. All right. So, so ultimately, what was the opportunity? How did we leverage benchmarks, right? So, using benchmarks and, we started with 110 FTEs, going through and analyzing their organization. Again, because of the regulatory requirements and the business partnering, it was critical to maintain 2 people within country. So 14 people stayed behind within country. And really, in terms of scope for potential optimization, we had 96 FTEs, right? Through organizational realignment, we can achieve 20% reduction in FTEs. And that's a typical savings that we see through, again, optimizing your organization, your span of controls, centralization. That's a common cost reduction. And so that brings it down to 77. But really, I think that the most important, the most impactful transformation lever here is process automation and optimization. And that really delivered 40% reduction, right? So that's an additional 30 FTEs. So at the end, the optimized finance and accounting organization, I ended up at 47. So that's a reduction of 49 FTEs. So that's very impactful. And however, if we go back to the actual benchmark, this particular company only brings it to the bottom performer based on the size. Again, even though we had a significant impact of the, from the transformation program, but that still equates to $2.5 million in annual savings. Right. So what we want to highlight there is that, a top performer may not make sense for all organizations. And that really sometimes can sound counterintuitive, right? The levels of investments in systems and process automation tools in order to get to the best in class, to be a top performer, may not deliver enough benefits for your organization, for your situation. It may not be fast enough to warrant the level of effort and investment. So, typically what we've seen, what we've experienced at Oxys is that process automation really can deliver strong ROIs that usually have a payback period of about 12 months or less. And most organizations do make that investment to achieve that result, as a transformation lever. Obviously the bottom performer is not where you want to reside, but we believe that even aspiring to be median, when you start your benchmark exercise, could be a very realistic goal, considering just some reorganization, some basic process improvement initiatives. Again, no one really wants to admit to aspire to be average. But again, as we illustrated in the previous example, it can be very impactful when you leverage benchmarks as a way to identify opportunity. So what should be the framework and the guiding principles for benchmarks, right? It really is to start with the end in mind. Communicate with your teams, ensure your organization is aligned on your objectives and what the goals that are going to be desired when you undertake this exercise. Once you know your mission, do some planning. Identify the benchmarks and the KPIs that you want to track that are specific to your industry, your revenue size, and really benchmark your performance internally and against others outside your industry. Oftentimes, we see companies that first will benchmark internally to get a sense of their process health, and then we'll go externally to see what their peers are doing, right? Use process mapping and data analysis to determine the areas that have the biggest gaps and prioritize those areas for improvement. And I think this is really where the real value of this exercise comes in, is benchmark on their own are just data points. They can guide you to low-hanging fruit. They can guide you to where opportunities are, but they're just data points. It is absolutely vital to drill down and identify the root cause of those identified areas so that you can develop an improvement strategy and then ultimately have an executable plan. And after you execute and after you need to establish a reporting mechanism where you're recalibrating, measure the results again, use lessons learned to avoid pitfalls in the future. And really, again, leveraging, for example, reporting tools such as Power BI to establish consistent and automated reporting, because ultimately the last step in this framework is really repeat. You want to have a culture of continuous improvement, and you want to keep repeating the benchmark exercise. So that's one way to remain competitive in this disruptive world.
This brings us to our second polling question. What's the most pressing pain point that you're trying to address in your finance organization? Angela, your turn.
And again, I just launched that. So audience, if you can quickly answer, I can share that quickly as well, and we can get back to learning. Though we're learning about you right now, aren't we? Just a couple more seconds. And again, audience, thank you so much for being so fast. We really appreciate that. Okay, a couple more seconds. This audience really is fast. I so appreciate it. Excellent. Under a minute, and we're getting most of the people to answer. That's excellent.
Great.
Yes. Okay. So I'll just share that with you really quickly. And so it looks like 10% say achieving a cost reduction target, 16% freeing up my team for higher value work, 23% improving quality, speed, and service to the business, 19% scaling to absorb future growth, and 32% all of the above. Wow.
Yeah, I find that the all of the above is the common answer that we get from people, because there's never one set issue that's impacting your business. There are pain points across the board. If anything that we've learned from this recent experience through this year has been, that there's so many different areas that we have to focus on, whether it's scale, whether it's flexibility, whether it's speed and decision making and speed and execution. And obviously cost reduction has become a main point. But what's interesting is it was the lowest rated factor, because the other ones I think are really the key drivers. So what you see from working with benchmarks is cost is an easy distinguisher, and you'll be able to determine that. Where it really gets interesting and using the benchmarks is to focus on these other areas and what you need to do to get you there. And I think that's where, as Enrique said, benchmarking is a data point. You have to dive a little deeper than that. What it does is it just points you in the right direction. So that brings us to our portion of the this webinar for the panel discussion. So I'm now going to bring in our panelists, and we'll talk about some of these different topics, starting with the topic of industry trends. Rachel, let's bring you into the conversation. So we've all lived through this crazy year. There's been a lot of upheaval in business operations. Have you seen any spike in interest from CFOs and finance organizations overall to benchmark themselves after COVID and the current economic conditions?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I don't think we've necessarily seen a spike in benchmarking, but I would say that the interest in benchmarking has remained high. We certainly haven't seen it decrease. So let's put it that way. The interest has remained very, very high. Now, I neglected to say in my introduction, I guess, that I'm part of the group that manages the finance research that we do, not from the metric standpoint, but from more of the qualitative research standpoint. So what I hear is what topics, that people want to hear about, and they want to learn more best practices around, and what benchmarks. And what we've definitely seen increasing are interest and questions around topics having to do with liquidity and cash management and cash forecasting and forecasting accuracy, having to do with planning and budgeting and forecasting and how to do that better in this environment of uncertainty, questions around how to do, scenario planning, and a great interest in business continuity and risk. So in fact, we're actually engaged in an enterprise risk management best practices study now. So to that end, this whole topic of liquidity, everybody's interested in liquidity benchmarks, and those tend to be some of the most popular benchmarks. I did pull some numbers on some of the liquidity benchmarks that we published and that we have. Do you want me to talk to those for a little bit, Eric? Or
That'd
you
be
want-
great. Yeah,
Oh, that
I'd
would
love
be
to hear 'em. Yes, the answer was yes.
Okay, all right. So some of the most popular liquidity type benchmarks that we monitor and we would recommend that people take a look at if you're not already. Number one, and I love this one, this is actually new, and it was suggested by our CFO, so we actually added it to our data collection. And this is days cash on hand. So the way that we define this is the number of days that an organization can essentially continue paying its operating expenses with the amount of cash that they currently have available. And I don't know about anybody else, I'm a big Dave Ramsey fan, so think about how he advises individuals to have at least 3 to 6 months of expenses on hand in cash. We're not talking in investments or anything like that, we're talking about in cash. So in terms of our benchmarking data, we see the median number for companies. So this is actual data when I looked at it the other day being about 85 days. That's the middle of the distribution. So that's a little under 3 months, but it ranges from about 70 days at the 25th percentile to 100 or more days at the 75th percentile. And I'm going to tell you, I think that is way too low. For organizations right now. It does depend on your industry, but I would say that companies need to build that up. So that's days cash on hand. Another one that's very popular is days sales outstanding, or DSO. I'm sure many of you hopefully monitor this metric already. And this one measures the average number of days it takes an organization to collect their payments from their customers. So again, just to give you some numbers in terms of the actual data, the median or the middle of the distribution there, and this is from thousands, by the way, of respondents, the median is 38 days for DSO. And that ranges from 30 days or less on the lower end of the distribution for the 25th percentile to 48 days or more for the 75th percentile. And ideally, you want to see, lower number, meaning you're getting cash in the door more quickly for your organization. Two more that we see that are very popular in terms of liquidity benchmarks that we'd recommend you be monitoring if you're not already. The flip side of the DSO metric is the days payable outstanding benchmark. And this one reflects the average number of days that it takes an organization to pay its creditors. So again, in terms of our actual benchmarking data, we see the median number or the middle of the distribution being 40 days. And this ranges from 30 days on the 25th percentile to 53 days or more on the 75th. And then the last, which is one that is pretty popular in the benchmarking realm for liquidity, is uncollectible balances. Now we look at it as the percentage of uncollectible balances per revenue, because we do have to normalize these types of metrics in order to make comparisons across companies. And we see the median for that benchmark, a key performance indicator, being 0.7%. Okay, and that's going to range between 0.53% at the 75th percentile to 0.86% or more. And I want you to think about this. If you're a company that has $1 billion in annual revenues at that median level of 0.7%, that's about $7 million in uncollectible balances. So that could be a real issue. Again, there could be some real industry differences since we're talking about industry benchmarks here. For example, talk about days cash on hand for a minute. If you're in the healthcare industry where you have to wait a long time for reimbursement from the insurance companies, and so you may need more days cash on hand. If you're in an industry where you don't need as much cash, although who doesn't in this time period, I guess some don't, you might need as little as 3 months. What I would say is that, so these are point time measures. With what's going on with the COVID situation and the economic recession, I think we would expect to see over the time these trend upward probably, as we get through this period of time. And then the last thing I would add is, as part of our mission as a nonprofit, we do publish and comment on many of these benchmarks for organizations, and we kind of expound upon the data and what it looks like in terms of the quartiles and the median, and talk about how organizations can improve upon those metrics. And we publish them monthly in partnership with CFO magazine online. So if you just Google the CFO metric of the month in APQC, you can see kind of the monthly different metrics that we've talked about, and you can see a summary of the days sales outstanding and the uncollectible balances, days payable, days cash on hand, and many others.
That's great. That's really interesting. I think the two topics that we keep hearing from our clients, and really just what the industry is talking about, is cash management and getting a better handle on cash, and then cost containment. And there's so many different versions of how to get to cost containment, whether it's looking at your current cost structure, whether it's looking at reducing some of the transaction volumes and how they're being handled. There's so many different angles around that. Have you seen that hasn't been as much of you haven't seen a spike in that area through this process? It's really been much more on the cash side, or has it been consistent across the board?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Eric. I don't know if I know the answer to that. Again, I just know, similar to what you've seen, that people are super interested in the cash management. In fact, we just rolled off an entire study on Treasury, and so looking at some best practices from a Treasury standpoint, and we're working on a best practices study in risk. And so liquidity and cash management and forecasting, FP&A again is another one. Now, RPA and the automation of various technologies, we did a project around the next 90 days with the pandemic and how people are reacting to that. And so certainly people are keeping their automation efforts high, and so that's another way to be more effective and efficient in their operations and finance.
Great, that's great, thank you. So let's continue on with some real world examples. We had highlighted one in the presentation of a $600 million company, and looked, and essentially if you saw what we were highlighting there, we were basically saying this is a company that was double the size of the bottom performing organization. There were some rationale around why their numbers were high, mostly because of the complexity of their operations in various markets. But at the end of the day, what it really pointed out was it gave us a roadmap to say, here's specific areas of focus. So you took, for example, general accounting, where they were 3.5 times the size of the bottom performer. What can you do about that? Well, you simply start to dive into how they process transactions, how they're handling reconciliations, how long is the close taking and why, and it starts to give you this set of solutions that you can begin to apply and bring it down. Rachel, continuing with you, do you have similar examples of companies? Do you typically see it through the process, or you're just at the front end, you don't see what the back end result looks like? I'm curious if companies come back to you and say, hey, this is what we learned.
Okay, well, we're working with companies that are doing benchmarking all the time. And we're trying to actually chronicle their journeys in many cases. Mm-hmm. So, we do have a whole case study series that we did around finance transformation and best-in-class finance functions. And so the types of examples, in that instance that we would see is where organizations are looking to standardize to a one finance type, structure, and really to reduce the cost of finance, to increase their automation, to optimize their structure, and to standardize their processes. And so those would be some of the kinds of things, that we're chronicling in our case study series. We see organizations, and again, we're talking to companies who are looking to benchmark the finance function and how to be more effective and efficient for overall finance, but also at the individual process level as well. So let's say they're looking to implement a new ERP, for example, and so they want to benchmark their finance function pre-ERP implementation. And then, they go through that for a period of time, and then hopefully they would come back and also see the results post-implementation. We are literally dealing with and speaking with organizations every day about benchmarking and what are the best metrics for them to look at, because I think it does get a little overwhelming. Some of those you talked about a little bit earlier.
Agreed. Enrique, you provided a good example in the presentation. Do you have another example that you think you can highlight real quick?
Well, I mean, kind of thinking through it, and maybe just I'll touch a little bit on what Rachel was saying specifically to automation. Obviously, what we've seen with clients is as an increased focus of the finance function to be able to bring in technology to the processes. When we think about it, traditionally, technology has sat within the IT function, and the IT function has been the driver of a lot of the technology, and more when we think about the concept of digital transformation or digital tools, there's technologies out there, for example, like Blackline or an Adra that does they automate reconciliations, that introduce workflow to the month end close. Those systems are really what we typically call systems of engagements, and what they do, they're deployed very rapidly. They don't have the same timeline as a let's say like as an ERP, very very long. These can be implemented within months, within weeks sometimes. And these really are not that intrusive, and they're deployed to augment the traditional technology. They're deployed to augment your ERP. They're not going to substitute that technology, but they're going to augment. And by augmenting it, you're going to be able to automate, and then essentially it's a twofold benefit. What it does is, we talked about cost containment. Obviously, it reduces the level of effort, reduces the level of FTEs that will be required. But what it also does is it gets you ready to quickly scale up, right? I think there's continued uncertainty, obviously, but I think we're all waiting to see when this COVID situation ends, when it ends, and how that's going to impact. And I think we're all expecting a rebound. Specifically some of the industries that have been more impacted than others. I think we're really expecting a rebound, and to be ready for that, to be able to quickly then scale up, something that we need to be prepared for. And so, in the previous highlight, I think, that we talked about that the intelligent automation, the digital component of it was really the biggest driver, the biggest lever, not necessarily just centralization and reorg of the function.
Great, thanks. So continuing with you, Enrique, what do you think are the most common mistakes that companies make when they're looking at benchmarking? And how do you recommend that they avoid some of these pitfalls?
Right. I think we talked a little bit about that, and Rachel highlighted as well. You've got to, first you've got to do some planning. You've got to do, if you're using benchmarks now, I think most of us have, according to the responses, but just review the KPIs, right? But start with the end in mind. Why is it that you're doing benchmarks? And I see oftentimes that, you're just going to go and track, a KPI because you think that's the right measure. But again, if you think about it, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Is it that you really want to have you want to have an impact on working capital? And so DSO, DPO, those are obviously very important metrics. So maybe those should have a little bit more focus. Once you benchmark it, what you need to do, and I think the pitfall, to answer your question, Eric, is that you have to make sure that you're benchmarking apples to apples, right? And so you need to make sure that you're segmenting the benchmarks, the KPIs by industry, by geography, by revenue side, so that that you're benchmarking apples to apples. So I think that's what I think is the biggest pitfall. If you just go out and start benchmarking against other industries, you can do that, and you should do that, but the initial priority should be know what your organization, and benchmark to your peers.
Great, thank you. So in the presentation, we had already, I think you heard Enrique's perspective, which I share, which is that top performer is not necessarily where you need to get to. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish and what the return on that investment is going to be. Sometimes, the investment is not worth the return, and you just really, you're fine being at medium. I mean, medium is where most people are. So we know you don't want to aspire to bottom, I don't think that's where anybody's looking to be, but median tends to be an area where a lot of people kind of congregate. Top is top for a reason, but usually there's a reason why they want to get there. There's the benefit of return on investment. So I don't know that you agree with me, Rachel. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I do agree with you. I think it's a very company-specific discussion and decision. And it really depends on the organization's goals, their objectives, and I think furthermore, the resources that they have to, to commit to it. So for example, an organization may do a benchmarking exercise, they get back the gap analysis, they look at it and they may determine, well, that gap is huge, it's a little bit daunting, so we're going to phase this approach, and they start by aspiring to the median, and then maybe 2 or 3 years down the road or what have you, aspire more to the top performance. Other organizations may, and certainly it's important to look at a balanced set of measures, so not to optimize one to the detriment of another, like cost to the detriment of quality or what have you. But other organizations may determine that because of the nature of their industry and because of all of their, regulations or strategy that they want to be, at the median or what have you. And they're accepting purposefully, less than top quartile performance because that's kind of what makes sense for them. I would say again, now when we're doing research, we're looking for, organizations that have success practices that they're willing to share. So many of the companies that we talk to have, let's say, done a benchmarking exercise, and they are definitely tell us that they're aspiring to a top quartile or a world-class type performance for the finance metrics. I think when we last talked about this topic, I mentioned we have recently done an order to cash project. And so naturally those folks are looking at order to cash metrics, and they're looking at those types of benchmarks. And so one of the companies that we profiled was a big pharma company, and by the name of Novartis. I'm sure many of you have heard of them. And so they are tracking order to cash performance against their industry benchmarks, again, with the aspiration of hitting the top quartile, just trying to be very, very optimistic over this period of time. They literally laid out a transformation roadmap for order to cash over the next couple of years. And they were tracking metrics such as the percentage of e-billing, and kind of watching how that trended with all of the types of standardization initiatives and improvement initiatives that they were working on for order to cash. So we would recommend that companies, once they do the benchmarking effort, they assess those gaps, and likely they use some type of prioritization mechanism. And this could be prioritized against, against your resources, against what's important to your stakeholders, against your strategy and other key criteria, and then select those opportunities for improvement based on the priorities that you have. Now, mind you, that said, you're always probably going to have some, just do it type initiatives that just make sense and hopefully don't need a business case. But that's some of what we're seeing there.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that the exercise of benchmarking in certain aspects is almost like a psychological experiment with people. I think they're very anxious to see where they sit in the benchmarking spectrum. Sometimes they're expecting to be worse than they are, and they want to be happily surprised. Sometimes they're expecting to be better than they are, and they get disappointed. But what I typically find, and I'm curious of your perspective, is that when people find themselves at a certain level, say towards the bottom, they start to rationalize and say, well, I'm there because I'm different. I'm this, I'm that. I have these complexities or these requirements, or I'm different than these other companies. I think one of the things that I think is important when it comes to this exercise is to really take a cold, hard look at yourself and not to rationalize why you're at a level, but determine what it's going to take to get to another level, and does it make sense for you? But that rationalization exercise, I think, has to be part of what you're doing here, and just adjusting to the realities of, hey, you may be at this level, and it's not because you're special or less than special. It's because that's how you perform. I'm curious if you've seen any of that as well, that kind of resistance to the number.
Yes. Was that for me, Eric?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. The answer is yes. That's a common refrain I guess we do hear from organizations, saying that they're different and trying to kind of explain away the differences. But the way that we try and encourage organizations is, benchmarking is directional. Oftentimes people are using reasonable approximates, but focus on not necessarily the specific, penny or whatever of the benchmark, but focus on the directionality of it and the size of the gaps. And for those areas that are such big gaps, those are areas you probably really need to kind of dig into and use, quality tools, something like the 5 whys or a cause and effect diagram or something like this to kind of dig into why is it that way? And I think furthermore to think about, does it have to be this way? Like if we have the luxury of starting whatever this is from scratch, and opening a new office in Europe or a new treasury department in Europe and starting from scratch, like would we still use, 10 different banks and 25 different bank accounts, So I mean, thinking about, does it have to be this way? And I think really the advantage of true process benchmarking, where you look outside of your own industry to what others are doing in other industries, and you find those comparators outside of your industry can truly kind of open your eyes to what is possible. And that's, I think, the lovely thing about benchmarking.
Interesting, very interesting. I want to jump to the next polling question to make sure we get them all in. So the next polling question was, are you considering intelligent automation as a or outsourcing as a tool for non-core transactional functions within your optimization initiatives next year? Oh, Angela, I'll turn that over to you.
Yep, Eric, I launched it, so thank you very much for that. We definitely want to get the polling questions in. This is such a interesting conversation and so helpful, I'm sure. Just that last, thought of the question and how to think about it, so valuable. So we'll just take another second, audience, to get your response here. And you know what I'll do, Eric, unless you're really looking for it, we'll just end the polling question and we'll go right back into the conversation so that we can, because we're coming out of 5 minutes more.
Yeah. And Eric, I wanted to quickly mention that for those of you that are going to answer intelligent automation in this question, we have a session coming up in 15 minutes about how to scale your robotic process automation program. So, that could be a good continuation to this.
Yeah, that's great, Fabiana. Thank you for mentioning that. So if you're interested in that, it is our last workshop at 5 p.m. And that's most common RPA implementation pitfalls and avoid them. Back to you, Eric.
Okay. So with that, I'll turn to the panel again and just ask for any final recommendations, lessons learned from this process of benchmarking, and really, what is your advice to people who are starting to look at this? Enrique, let's start with you.
Yeah, so just to do a bit of a recap, make sure this is part of part of your objectives, right? It's we got a polling question coming, but I'll keep talking. Make sure this is part of your day-to-day, right? This is you can use benchmark as a way to identify, right? Oftentimes it could be a blaring neon sign that points you to areas of opportunity if you're looking for that, right? But it can be a very valuable tool to be able to measure just process health, to be able to identify where areas where you can improve. But again, you've got to take it as a data point. You have to go down, you have to analyze why that is. So I'll kind of use an example. It may be that when you benchmark the amount of invoices that your AP department is processing, that you're doing well. It may look like your AP department is being very productive because they're processing more invoices than your peers. Well, if you kind of dig down, maybe your employees are working extra overtime, and that's the reason why they're able to process, right? So you've got to take it with a grain of salt, and you have to take it as the data point. You got to go one step lower and really identify what's the driver for that benchmark, and what are some of the things that can get you to bridge that gap wherever you want to be.
Thanks, Enrique. Rachel, any final thoughts?
Yes, I just kind of reiterate what Enrique said. I think another way to think about it is that benchmarking is an important part of any organization's continuous improvement toolkit. So think about that as something, we see many organizations, let's say, do a full scale like finance benchmarking effort on an annual basis or on an every other year basis, or, part of their transformation efforts, like a pre and a post type thing. But some words of wisdom I just would hope to leave you with from our founder, Jack Grayson, who founded our organization 40 some odd years ago. And he came to work until he was in his 90s and just had a fascinating life. He was on the Nixon Price Council. He was dean of several major universities. But his passion was helping organizations to improve their productivity and their quality. And the way that he defined benchmarking is the practice of being humble enough to admit that others are better at something and being wise enough to learn to match and even surpass them at it. So just always think about, being a learning organization. And that's what benchmarking can help you to do. And look outside of your industry. Look within your organization for benchmarking, look within your industry, but also look outside of your industry.
That's great advice. I love that sentiment. Thank you for sharing that. And with that, we'll turn it over to we probably have about a minute and not much time. But are there any questions from the audience?
There are none, but Rachel, I don't know if you would want to repeat that website that you had mentioned earlier. I know that someone was asking about that website with the KPIs. You mentioned
yes. And I can send it to you again on our site for follow-up if you'd like. But we do a column monthly with CFO magazine online, and it's called the Metric of the Month. So literally, if you just Google CFO Metric of the Month and you Google APQC, and let's say you Google, October 2020, you'll see, or if you Google CFO Metric of the Month and APQC and Day Sales Outstanding, you'll see the data, and then also kind of what we had to say about how to define it and how to improve upon that metric. And that's with commentary from our CFO, because it's supposed to be from the CFO to CFOs and to other practitioners. So
that's great.
Yeah. And also, if anyone is wondering how are they benchmarking versus their competitor, we're going to have this virtual booth open tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. and we can have those conversations that are more tailored to your size and your industry. So, you're welcome to join us and we can, brainstorm a little bit about where the opportunities can potentially be.
That's great. Fabiana, thank you for bringing that up. I was just going to mention that myself. Definitely go to the exhibit hall so that you can get more distinct information. It is 4:51, so I'm going to say goodnight to all of you. Thank you, Ox, as always, for sharing your expertise with our members and the friends of the CFO Leadership Council. Stay well and stay connected, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good.